Hello, and welcome to Scholars Hub at Home. I am Rose Lucibello, Manager, Advancement Events. Happy Pride Month. Thank you for joining us for today's lecture, Challenged Inclusion, LGBTQ and Asylum Seekers, Refugees and Mental Health, with Nick Muley, Professor, School of Gender, Sexuality and Women's Studies, and Sexuality Studies Coordinator, and faculty of LAMPS. I accept the responsibility to acknowledge the land that I am on. Because we're not gathered in the same space, the land I'm about to acknowledge might not be for the territory you are on. Please take the responsibility to acknowledge the traditional territory you are on. The website nativeland.ca is a good resource for this. As a member of the York University community, I recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Takaranto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. Before we introduce our speaker today, I'm excited to tell you that York University is honored to be recognized among the world's top 40 universities in the 2023 Times Higher Education Impact Rankings for our commitment towards advancing the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Now, we would like to conduct a quick poll before each session begins. The question is, how would you rate your knowledge regarding the topic of today's presentation? The poll should pop up on your screen right now. Thank you. It is helpful for our speakers to know more about who is in our audience. If you need help with Zoom webinar, feel free to click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and enter your question. Our team is ready to help you. The same button may be used to submit questions for our guest speaker to answer during the Q&A period following today's presentation. Please note that all your questions and comments are visible to our panelists and staff working behind the scenes. We ask that you please keep your comments relevant and respectful. Now I would like to introduce you to our guest speaker, Professor Nick Muley. Nick Muley, PhD, is a professor in the School of Social Work, cross-appointed to the Faculty of Health and the School of Gender, Sexuality and Women's Studies, where he is coordinator of the Sexuality Studies program at York University in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. His research interests include the social inclusion, exclusion of LGBTQI populations in social policy and service provision, and the degree of their recognition as distinct communities in cultural, systemic, and structural contexts. He also engages in critical analysis of the LGBTQI movement and the development of queer liberation theory. We are pleased you could make the time to join us today. Welcome, Professor Muley.
Thanks so much, Rose, and thank you also to Marjan and everyone else who is involved in this, and for the invitation to speak today. I'm really happy to be here. And welcome to everyone who has joined us. And as was already mentioned, happy Pride Month, this being June. And just give me one moment and I will start my presentation. There we are. So today I'm going to talk to you about challenged inclusion, LGBTQ plus asylum seekers, refugees, and mental health. And the first part of my title is really what I'm trying to emphasize here, and that is that although asylum seekers and refugees that come from the LGBTQ plus communities are recognized here in Canada when they apply for asylum or refugee status for coming from those communities, their inclusion is somewhat challenged on a number of fronts. And you'll learn more about that throughout my presentation, which for the most part will be educational and issue-oriented, less research heavy. I decided not to get into the hard data that we had gathered over the last number of years, but rather just to provide you with the overriding issues that affect these populations when it comes to this issue. So basic overview, I'm going to begin with a context to give you a bit of background on this issue. I'll move into definitions so you understand the key terms and terminology that are used when it comes to this. Then I'll move on to Canadian recognition of LGBTQ plus asylum seekers and refugees and what exactly that means, before moving on to policies that back that up and their limitations. I'll then move on to mental health implications that impact these populations, and then moving on to settlement services for LGBTQ plus asylum seekers and refugees in response to those that do come to Canada as their destination. I'll then move on to a kind of critical analysis that looks at whether Canada is really a safe haven or is engaged in homonationalism, before I conclude with my contact information. So starting off with context, currently it is illegal to engage in same-sex intimacies in 67 countries, including 38 countries in which same-sex intimacy between women is illegal. So 67 countries definitely name men as the target of their laws, but of those, 38 actually explicitly speak to women engaged in same-sex relations. Additionally, there are 3 countries that have anti-LGBTQ propaganda laws, which has serious implications on LGBTQ communities developing themselves as a community, congregating, creating supports for each other, and educating the public. These propaganda laws restrict all of that and basically silence their existence. 10 countries criminalize forms of gender expression, and sentences with regard to any kind of illegalities can include 0 to 10 years imprisonment, 10 years to life imprisonment, lashes, corporal punishment, unspecified sentences that can exist in various countries depending on laws, and finally the death penalty, the most severe form of penalty when this comes up in their laws in 7 countries around the world currently. Some definitions to help you understand some of the terminology that's being used. When we speak of asylum seekers, we're talking about those that are seeking asylum class, meaning asylum is a classification in the system due to civil war, armed conflict, or massive violation of human rights. And so basically, these are individuals coming into a host country without any status, and they're seeking asylum because of these very reasons. With refugees, we're talking about people forced to leave their country of origin due to serious human rights abuses or fear of persecution, and they're seeking status as a refugee claimant in the host country. When I refer to LGBTQ+, I'm talking about members of the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer plus communities categorized as a particular social group. So when you're looking at policy, one of the categories that they list are social groups, and the LGBTQ+ populations fall under that category of a social group. A key player in all of this here in Canada is the Immigration and Refugee Board, known as the IRB. This is an independent administrative tribunal that issues decisions on immigration and refugee matters. So a very powerful board that determines whether someone can stay in this country as a refugee or not. And finally, mental health, that I'll be speaking to in a very basic definition, and that this encapsulates our emotional, psychological, and social well-being. So with regard to Canadian recognition of LGBTQ+ asylum seekers and refugees, Canada is one of a number of countries that recognizes sexual orientation and gender identity and expression as grounds for asylum status. I was kind of trying to find out exactly what the actual number was. It's very hard to get. I think part of this is because this changes over time. But when we were conducting the research, I would say about 4 or 5, maybe even 6 years ago, the number at that time was about 44 countries in the world recognized these populations, and Canada was one of them. Such protections established due to persecution of LGBTQ people criminally and or socially in many parts of the world. And of course, this was brought forward by LGBTQ plus activists themselves and human rights defenders, raising this reality, especially at the international level with international bodies such as the UN, and bringing this to the attention of many nation states and urging that these populations need protection given the unique circumstances they can find themselves in. Different forms of persecution, and what I have listed here speaks more specifically to those countries for which repression is paramount, and there are laws in the books against same-sex intimacy. And so that can include arrest, detention, death threats, rape, torture, and the worst of all, of course, the 7 countries I mentioned, the death penalty. There are a set of policies that do exist when it comes to this for those that do recognize these populations. The UNHCR, which is the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, Guidelines on International Protection number 9, claims to refugee status based on sexual orientation and or gender identity, speaks to these issues at the international level. And this has been really helpful. And again, this was fought for by LGBTQ plus activists and human rights defenders, and backed up by major human rights organizations such as Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch to have these populations recognized. The downside of this, of course, like most things at the UN, and that is that nation states need to sign on to these things. And this is observed by a limited number of countries around the world. So not all countries have signed on to these, to protection number 9. But the advocacy is ongoing when it comes to that. Here in Canada, we have the Immigration and Refugee Board, the IRB, Chairperson's Guideline 9, proceedings before the IRB involving sexual orientation and gender identity and expression. So this is a set of policies here in Canada in which the IRB recognizes these populations. A real downside of these policies is that individuals who want to claim their asylum or refugee status based on their sexual orientation and or gender identity and expression must prove that they are coming from the LGBTQ plus populations. This is quite an onerous task, very difficult, stress-inducing, and many of our participants in the research said was actually re-traumatizing. There was a time, I'll just share very briefly here, where claimants were so desperate, and with the support of their lawyers, were producing photographs and video footage of them having sex with a person of the same sex to present to the IRB to prove that they are from the LGBTQ plus communities. When a lot of us as activists learned of this, we were quite disturbed and found this to be incredibly invasive, and urged that this stop, and it has stopped since. But still, this policy is in place, and there's other means and ways that people are trying to find as creative as possible through their lawyers to try to convince the IRB that they are actually from these communities. And this includes getting letters from queer-based organizations, having a picture taken of them at Pride events, for example, volunteering within the LGBTQ plus communities, that sort of thing. Now, there are a series of mental health implications for to us LGBTQ plus people who are seeking refugee or asylum status here in Canada. And what I've laid out here in these points is kind of a trajectory of what people face when they come to the realization that they can no longer stay in their country of origin. So pre-migration, a lot of these individuals experience hypersensitivity to anticipated homophobia and transphobia. Whether there are rumors going around about them, whether there are suspicions, comments being made, all the way through to people being outed or attacked and assaulted in the streets. These are serious situations that people are dealing with and coming to realize pre-migration that they're probably not going to be safe staying in their country of origin. With regard to the migration process, these are dangerous circumstances and often harrowing stories. in transit to destination. For many of these individuals, it's really difficult to get out of their country of origin because they may have great difficulty getting a visa to leave. Even if they can, they often have to travel through 2, 3, and sometimes 4 countries to get to their country of destination. All of these countries having really repressive laws. And so they're feeling very much under threat through this whole process. In terms of post-migration, there is a desperate need of resources for settlement, overwhelming sense of isolation. Keep in mind that when someone arrives here, these resources are not necessarily readily available, and anything you can think of, they are in need of. First and foremost, housing, food, clothing in many cases, because many of them are not prepared for a colder climate here, a lawyer, community resources, all of those things tend to be lacking. And so access to information and resources is really difficult for many of them because this is not readily available. For example, arriving at an airport, this is, many of our participants shared kind of wandering the hallways of the airport trying to find assistance because they didn't know where to turn or where to ask questions. And not to mention the fact that if English is not a language you speak, that's an even further barrier. There's also the grappling with identities. For many of these individuals, they come from countries in which LGBTQ is not necessarily a specified identity. They were not socialized that way. And now to come into a country such as Canada and having to prove that this is your identity before the IRB can be a real challenge because that's not the way they were socialized. And so this creates some real problems in terms of grappling with what does this identity actually mean and how do I take this on and try to convince a board that's going to determine whether I can stay or not. Asylum seeking and refugee claims and process is very stressful and very difficult on these individuals. There's a lot of work that has to be pulled together to create their file and to make the claim formally through a lawyer. And it's very difficult and very traumatizing for a lot of individuals while they're still dealing with mentally, while they're still dealing with having left their home of origin, their country of origin, meeting their family, meeting their friends, their coworkers, their career. It's a real transition in their life that has serious implications for them. And so all of this leads to trauma. This came up a lot in our research in which they are experiencing oppression, violence, and discrimination, certainly in their country of origin, which is why they felt the need to escape. But also what was noteworthy is that they also experienced that here in Canada through intersectional forms of oppression, such as racism, along with homophobia or transphobia, among other forms of oppression. So how do we assist these individuals once they're here? What kind of settlement services can we have in place for them? And unfortunately, such services tend to be limited and under-resourced. As I think many of you may be aware, the settlement services sector of Canada tends to be, generally speaking, not well funded. And so there's a struggle there just to begin with. In terms of mainstream settlement services, there's a lack of training and sensitivity regarding service provision to LGBTQ plus individuals. There's just not a lot of knowledge there. There's a great need for education, and people need to be more sensitized to these issues. With regard to the few LGBTQ plus specified services for LGBTQ plus asylum seekers and refugees, they too are lacking a lot of resources and tend to be centrally located in large urban centers. So if these asylum seekers or refugees are settling outside of the urban centers, it's even more difficult. But we do know that the large cities do attract a lot of them to come here for whatever resources that they can actually access. And that's a real draw for a lot of them. But once they're here, say for example, here in Toronto, getting housing, as we know, which is very expensive now, is difficult, and they're not necessarily going to be in the downtown area, which is where these kind of settlement services that are particular to LGBTQ plus populations are located. And so even having transportation money to get to from rather wherever they're living in the city down to downtown and back is very difficult. And so knowledge of and accessibility to such services is limited. And so there is a great need to develop these further and to be better supported by the state when it comes to this. And so with this slide, I'm talking here about a bit of a critical analysis of whether Canada is seen as a safe haven or it's engaging in homonationalism. Oftentimes, when we look at policy and particular governments that are in power, they tend to frame refugees in various forms. And so one of the ways that they do this is to accuse them of being bogus refugees or fraudulent or illegitimate. This was actual language that was used quite frequently during the Harper years of government here in Canada. With our Trudeau government now, the kind of language that we're hearing is that these are individuals that are in need and actually can be contributing to Canadian society. That's a much more positive spin on it. Nevertheless, as we dig deeper in this, there are some real challenges for these individuals. Recognizing SOGI, that's a short form for sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression as grounds for asylum and refugee status frames Canada as a safe haven. We often hear our government touting this, that we welcome such individuals. They are recognized in our policies for asylum and refugee status, without really talking about the fact that they have to prove they're from these communities, or the fact that their cases may not go through and they may be sent back to their country of origin, which is a very dangerous thing for them. The safe haven is a homonationalist narrative serving Canada as an open and accepting country while obscuring damaging policies, again, such as proof of SOGI, as well as the more recent Canada-US Safe Third Country Agreement and inadequate settlement services. So when I'm using the term homonationalism, what I'm referring to there, it's a kind of a socio-political way of framing things so that the country looks really good because it's open to and accepting of a minority population such as the LGBTQ plus communities, yet obscuring the fact that when you scratch the surface, there are a lot of issues that exist and that these populations are still struggling with within the very country that's claiming that they're so wonderful for that, in this case being Canada. So that's what I mean by homonationalism. Such credibility measures and evidentiary matters, again, with regard to individuals having to prove their sexual orientation and gender identity, are premised on Western notions of sexuality and gender. And Western notions, as I was mentioning earlier, are very identity-based, which may not be the experience of these very people that are trying to settle here. So this lacks nuance and is contributing to a form of recolonization and re-traumatization of these individuals when they come into a country such as Canada that's claiming to be a safe haven for them. So as we celebrate Pride this month, and that in and of itself tends to be a very positive thing, very much highlighting partying and stuff, we shouldn't forget our history when it comes to Pride. And Pride came about because there was protest. There was protest at how LGBTQ plus people were treated and the oppressions that we were experiencing and continue to experience. And today's talk was very much around highlighting this particular population and the oppressions they continue to experience. So when we're celebrating Pride, we should never forget that there are many others that need to be better supported on many fronts. So with that, I'm going to conclude with my contact information. If people want to be in touch with me with regard to today's presentation with any questions or want to discuss this further, you're more than welcome to reach out to me. But with regard to today's talk, I understand we go back to Rose to facilitate questioning.
Yes, thank you so much, Professor, for that timely and informative talk. Feel free to stop sharing your screen at this time. And for the audience, we now have time for questions. So please feel free to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions. And if you're watching live on Facebook, you're welcome to submit questions through there as well. So we can get started. We do have a question here. You were just speaking about Canada touting itself as being a country that accepts LGBTQ plus and asylum seekers and refugee claimants. Yet your research shows that this is not necessarily the case. So would you say that we are sending a false impression to the LGBTQ people who are seeking refuge here?
Yes, that's a very good way of putting it. And this came up a lot in our research, that there is a real false impression that's happening because oftentimes people learn of Canada from other parts of the world through word of mouth as well as the internet. And that kind of narrative can raise a lot of hopes. It's almost like dream making, that, you know, here's a country that will accept me, and I can go there, and I can settle there. But absolutely, there is no actual guarantee. You do have to go through a process. It's quite an onerous and rigorous process of proving that you are from these communities and that you warrant being able to stay in this country. Oftentimes, part of the files also include trying to find proof that persecution does exist in your country of origin. And in some of these countries, it's really difficult to get that information because that's not data that's necessarily gathered. And in some of these countries, they will argue that LGBTQ plus people don't exist in those countries. So if these people don't exist, then where are you going to find data, right? So it's very difficult. The flip side of that as well is, even if you're successful, even if you get your claim, right, you become a refugee in Canada, and you're allowed to stay, all those issues I mentioned around the lack of resources, having to find work, the isolation, the being disconnected from family back home, it's really difficult. There's a lot of challenges that are not well supported.
I'm just curious, there are some questions coming in, but you prompted me to think, are there any countries you would say are doing this well, like that, to your knowledge? Just
not that I know of. I remember presenting when we were more fresh with our data, just coming out with it. I presented at an international conference in Australia, which is another country that similar to Canada, does recognize these populations. Thinking that I'm going to go there and give bad news. But researchers from that country presented just before me, and their news was just as bad as ours. So that's just one example, anyway, of how much work needs to be done.
Mm-hmm. So I have a question from someone in the audience, Beck, and their question is, if a trans person can't get ID documents with their correct name and gender in their country of origin, what challenges do they face from the Canadian government in getting correct documents here?
Similar challenges, and this can really complicate such files, especially at the IRB, and then it becomes impingent upon the lawyer to have to argue quite vociferously that this kind of documentation is very difficult to get in the country of origin. Sometimes when it comes to trans claimants, they will tap into medical files as well. There's mixed reaction to that. Some of them welcome that, the claimants themselves saying, you know, this is the proof I need, so sure, put it in the file. And others will claim that that can be quite invasive as well, because, you know, you have a whole board going over your medical files, right? So.
Another question with a comment first. An excellent presentation. Thank you. Coming from within the audience. Wondering if any part of your research focuses on trans individuals, or is it just queer folks in general? I feel that trans refugees face a unique set of challenges compared to their queer peers. This is a question from the audience.
Yeah, so our research kind of followed the language that was in the policy, and again, SOGI for short, sexual orientation and gender identity and expression. And so we did look at both, and we had our participants self-identify in the research what their sexual orientation is, how they identified gender-wise, how they expressed themselves gender-wise, and that was what helped us determine where people landed when it came to those issues. And part of our research involved focus groups. And so we did have a number of trans people speak very specifically to the unique circumstances that they experience being a trans person.
Mm-hmm. Another question from Agnes. Could you please say a few words about the impact of the Canada-US Safe Third Country Agreement in the context of SOGI claims?
Yeah, so that third country agreement, as people may have heard, and it's been in the media in the last few months, and human rights activists are battling against it, is basically restricting anyone crossing the border from any kind of recognized and legitimate ports of entry. There are particular ports of entry between Canada and the US, and people are coming in from other ports of entry that are not recognized. And so if they attempt to do so, they will be turned back, and they'll be restricted, they'll be blocked. And so why human rights activists are fighting against this is because it lacks human compassion, right? That for some individuals, and especially if you are feeling endangered or under threat, will try to go to the port of entry that's closest to them and try to get in that way. Now, the government has this kind of cynical take on this, that these people are trying to sneak into the country and not use the formal system to apply for asylum or refugee status. And that's not necessarily true for many of these individuals who are trying to get in. They're just trying to cross the border and start that process. It may not be the recognized border, but nevertheless, it is anticipated that the majority of them will go through the recognized process.
Okay, wow. I have a question from Facebook. What is the biggest misconception or assumption about LGBTQ plus refugees that you feel is an incorrect narrative that's carried in North America or in the Western world?
That's a difficult question because there's a number of misconceptions that exist. I think a little earlier I was saying that the whole notion of go to Canada, you'll be safe. They won't give you any problems is not necessarily true, right? I mean, again, the process itself is quite onerous, and also there's a real rise of right-wing fascism that's really happening in this country right now. We see this with many attacks against trans people, trans story time issues. Pride events across the country are seeking increased insurance and protection measures. This is very real, and so we're not as safe. We're not as safe as Canada tries to present itself as being. So that can be a real misconception. Another misconception that I had spoken to a little earlier as well is this notion of Canada wanting individuals to really position themselves in an identity-based approach with LGBTQ+. That is understandable from a policy perspective, because if someone's going to say, I want to seek refugee status under this particular social group, you are in essence saying you are a member of that social group. But then the IRB does require you to really zero in on, are you lesbian? Are you gay? Are you a trans person? Are you bisexual, right? And for a lot of these individuals, that's not their upbringing. And that's a real misconception that they can just come here from the way they were socialized into a country such as ours. And by doing that, Canada's imposing a form of identity-based legitimization in this country that people are not necessarily used to. They weren't raised that way. They weren't thinking that way. And yet they have to get their minds wrapped around that and use that in their process to convince the IRB to be able to stay.
Another question from Tom. What is your understanding of the PRAR success rate of failed refugee claimants to stop the removal back to the failed refugee claimants' original countries?
I don't have information on that, and that's not necessarily easy to acquire either. It is scary when this happens. So I can't really answer the question in terms of numbers, but what I will speak to on a qualitative side is that the really traumatizing and stressful process of applying for refugee status is the worry that you may not succeed. And if you don't get the status, it means you'll be sent back. And it also means that there's a chance that what you shared in your process to try to get status could get back to your country of origin. Mm-hmm. And once they know, then you're really in danger, right? So this is really scary. I mean, even last night I was looking at, I was signing off on one of those change.org petitions for a Ugandan man who is from the LGBTQ plus community, who failed his claim and will be deported, right? And as many people may know, in the last month and a half, Uganda instituted a series of anti-LGBTQ laws in that country. So don't have the actual numbers, but it is a really scary process that if you don't succeed in your claim, word could get back to your country of origin, and then you're being sent right back there, and people may know, right?
So this question, I think, kind of is, with what you're saying, it'll be an interesting next question. So this is from an attendee saying, verifying the identity of queer refugees is challenging and invasive, but do you think that it sometimes might be necessary? I think this is being framed on how do we make sure that non-queer folks are not trying to take advantage of, I guess, any, advantages or loopholes to also claim, to get into the country.
Right, and that is a good question, because it's very much behind the policy. I mean, I think that's why that policy is in place, is that there are people who may use this as a loophole to just kind of jump through and say, well, I'll just say I'm gay and succeed with my claim, right? Even though they aren't. And so we had some pretty in-depth discussions about this when we were conducting our research and how to address this in terms of our recommendations. And one of the things that helped guide us was that the European Court at one point had a similar policy that we have currently in Canada, but then dropped it. And the arguments behind dropping it and not necessarily having such a policy in place is to go with an approach, and I have used this repeatedly because I'm on this list of consultants with the IRB whenever they update their policies, and that is that rather than trying to seek proof of LGBTQ plus status, try to get proof of persecution in their country of origin. Because regardless of their LGBTQ plus status, if you are being framed as such, if you are being accused of being from those communities and you are under threat and you are being persecuted for it, that alone should be reason that you need to get out, because something serious could happen to you or you can lose your life, right? So that's how the European Court approaches it. That became our recommendation, that it should be less around people proving that they're from those communities, but rather that proving that persecution is real and exists in their country of origin is what should really matter. And if they were under threat there, then that should carry the case forward. That's what the European Court uses, and I continue to consult and advocate that the Canadian system should do the same.
That makes sense. Another question here from Tom in the audience. Can you name some groups that help LGBTQ plus refugee claimants in Canada?
Yes. Locally, I know that there are organizations and groups that do work in this area. So for example, the 519 Community Center has a newcomers group that is very popular. It attracts a lot of people. I will say, and I hope this doesn't come across as a critique, because they do really important work, but there are limitations in anything and everything, right? When we were doing our research, we were well connected with them, and we were able to attract a lot of participants to our study from there. And one of the observations I made was, it was interesting that the director of the program came from the Caribbean. And so word of mouth got around that she was from the Caribbean. And so it attracted a lot of people from South America to come into that program because of just that familiarity, that comfort level of knowing that someone there that works there will understand where I'm coming from, right? But it had me questioning, what about all the others? You know, we're in a big world, right? And certainly they have people from many other countries as well, but it just speaks to the limitations of funding, the limitations of what workers you hire and who they attract. So that's one example. I just recently learned that there's an African-based group that's very grassroots, completely volunteer run, that's doing work in this area as well. So that's really helpful to have. Ocasi here in the city does work in this area. And Rainbow Railroad is probably the more high profile group that has a very specified mandate that deals with this issue here in Canada.
Great. We have one final question came from Facebook. Is there a different process or urgent process for refugees coming from countries like Uganda, for example, where persecution is violent and poses a very high risk, versus countries where perhaps it's just more discriminatory as opposed to violent? Would you say that there's actually a scale of how the risk is measured for people who are, you know, trying to come to Canada?
The process would be the same in terms of applying for status in order to be able to stay. I think I'm trying to find the right word. The strength of the case would vary, right? So the question, I think, is right on when it talks about, if you mention a country like Uganda, there is a higher level of understanding or knowledge about what's happening there. And there's also material that you can use, evidentiary material that you can use. So for example, these anti-LGBTQ plus laws that were just implemented a month ago or so, that's data, that's documentation you can gather very easily and then put that in the file and say, this is when it happened, this is when it was implemented, and what have you. So any country that has that kind of documentation, it strengthens the file, right? But other countries where the repression is very much based on silencing and that these people just don't exist here and that sort of thing, it's very hard to draw up data, then those cases have a greater challenge in going forward.
One last question snuck in, so I'll just ask it. Are there any organizations providing gender affirming services for these refugees?
I would say the organizations I mentioned definitely all do. And I know there are efforts to try to educate the mainstream settlement services to recognize that gender can be very diverse, the way people identify, the way they express themselves, as well as a diversity of sexual orientation, so that they shouldn't assume that anyone who comes into their services is necessarily heterosexual or cisgendered.
Well, thank you so much for being with us today and for enlightening us with your research and your knowledge on this topic. Really grateful to have you.
Thanks for having me.
And you're now welcome to turn off your video, and happy Pride. We'll see you soon. For those of you who would like to share today's session with your family and friends, it will be posted to our YouTube page at youtube.com/YorkU alumni. You can also watch past lectures that you may have missed. We have one more poll question for you. How would you rate your knowledge of today's topic following this discussion? It should pop up on your screen right now. Great, thank you. Join us for our next Scholars Hub at Home session in July, and it will be up on our website. Everyone can register for that event and learn more about upcoming sessions at yorku.ca/alumni and friends. Thank you and be well.